Welcome back to the Plus Ultra Podcast. This is Tracy R. Twyman. Now comes part 2 of our interview with Peter Levenda, author of Unholy Alliance, A History of Nazi Involvement with the Occult, and the brand new 3-part series, Sinister Forces, A Grimoire of American Political Witchcraft. Later on, we're going to get into the subject of the Necronomicon, which Levenda had some involvement with, and has even been rumored to be the author of. But first, a little necessary background information on the man Levenda. He's led an exciting life that started with him founding his own Orthodox church, attending the funeral of Robert Kennedy as a clergyman, and working as an unofficial intelligence asset for the U.S. military. Here once again is Peter Levenda. Peter, where did you grow up, and what sort of upbringing did you have?
Well, I grew up all around the country. I was born in New York City, but my parents moved around a lot as I was growing up. So we lived in Indiana and Chicago for a number of years, in New Hampshire for a couple of years, but I basically graduated from high school in New York City. We eventually made our way back there. My father was a kind of a failed actor, and between one thing and another, our family just wound up wandering around the country looking for work.
And I understand that your father, at one point, was involved in something that has caused you a bit of embarrassment and got you some scrutiny from the government, too.
Yeah, his name is mentioned in a few books, mostly books written by academics about a particular period in the history of Gary, Indiana, which is where he was born and raised. And he was involved in something called the Gary School Strike, which I believe was 1945 or 1946, something like that. And that was a school strike that was started over integration. There was a move to integrate the public schools in Gary, Indiana. And my father was involved in some kind of debating team at Froebel High School, which is where he was going to school. And he was the president of the Students' Union at the same time. And the debate was over whether or not the schools should be integrated or segregated. And my father came down on the segregation part and became kind of well known as a segregationist and as the leader of the Gary school strike. So basically he was a segregationist. And it caused so much furor in the country at the time that Frank Sinatra, who was on his way, I guess, to some gig in Chicago, decided he would stop over in Gary, Indiana, and try to solve the problem to the force of his own personality, I suppose. So he made a visit to the Gary High School auditorium where there was a big meeting on the issue of integrating the schools, and he was not warmly received. He was seen basically as an outsider trying to come in and solve the problems. And not finding very much success there, he went to my father's home to try to convince him to call off the school strike. So you'll find in there's a book out, I believe, that's called The Frank Sinatra Files, which is a collection of the FBI files on Sinatra, particularly during this period, and my father's name is mentioned there a number of times. The FBI thought my father was a communist, which is the funniest thing, because they knew that Sinatra had some kind of associations with some leftist or socialist types, and they thought that Sinatra's presence in Indiana was some kind of a socialist thing, and therefore they were making the assumption that my father was somehow a communist, which was 180 degrees opposite from what he was. I mean, as a segregationist, he was a right-wing kind of John Bircher type, and there was no way on earth that you could mistake him for a communist. But at any rate, the FBI thought he might be, so they were collecting files on him.
How did your father react to having Frank Sinatra come over to his house?
He threw him out.
What was his name?
Leonard Levenda.
Now, I understand around the time you were going to graduate high school, you were staring the possibility of the draft in the face and trying to figure out how to get out of that, and you couldn't afford to go to college to use that as a way out. So you and a friend of yours named Andrew came up with a very unusual idea. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Well, like many things in life, there's always more than one motivation. My friend and I were very involved in religious studies, let's say. I was very involved in studying religion. It had always been a fascination of mine since I was very young. And all forms of religion, including, extreme forms like occultism or mysticism on the one hand, and different religious groups on the other. I would haunt all sorts of churches and temples, whatever I could find, just to get some kind of an idea of what was going on. And I was very religiously minded in my late teens. I was really thinking seriously of some kind of religious vocation. And I had met a friend of mine in high school in the Bronx who had a similar background to mine. He was half Czech and half Slovak. And he also had a fascination for the church, but his fascination was more for the pomp and ceremony of it. Mm. He liked the vestments, and he liked the golden chalices and all the rest of it. And he liked the way in which clergymen were afforded all sorts of extra privileges that the rest of us didn't enjoy. And this was a different time, I have to remind you and your listeners. Back in the 1960s, clergymen had a lot of status. I mean, they wouldn't get charged going on a bus or a subway. People would just, allow them on for free. Just the kind of respect that they gave. A clergyman could walk into almost any building anywhere and be accorded all sorts of immediate respect. These days, of course, that's changed a lot, but in the old days, this was an old-fashioned kind of idea, and my friend really liked that. So, two of us were graduating high school in 1968, which pretty much meant we were probably going to Vietnam or something close to it. And my idea was, why not form a church? Because we knew that clergymen would not be drafted. So we formed a church. We organized a church around a man that we knew who was a bishop from Slovakia who was living as a displaced person in the United States. And he had a very checkered career in the church. He was involved with a church in Czechoslovakia. There was the invasion by the Nazis and the invasion by the Russians. And eventually he got out and came to the United States, and the church was sort of formed around him. So we got together and said, let's form a church. Let's use this guy as our spiritual leader, and we'll incorporate the church, and we'll become clergymen in the church.
You, of course, were 17 years old at the time?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Please continue. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, well, we were a little precocious, it's true. But, it was 1968, it was Vietnam. I mean, we were motivated. So the motivation was definitely there. And so we said, let's do this. And we incorporated it. Of course, we were too young, actually, to sign the incorporation papers ourselves. So we had to get other people to help us do that. And so we had adults sign off on the papers, and we incorporated the church. And we held services. I mean, we held services every Sunday. We went and visited other churches in New York City. This was an Orthodox church.
Who came to the services?
Excuse me?
Did people come to the services?
Oh, sometimes. Friends of ours, perhaps. It got to the point where we had developed a kind of a small floating congregation, We were intent on doing this the right way, so we were trying to run a legitimate ecclesiastical type organization. I mean, that was the whole point. So what we did is we imposed upon a Protestant minister in the Bronx who had a church, a very nice Dutch Reformed church, and we managed to cut a deal with him that we would be able to use his church for services, on days when he wasn't using it. So he would have a service on Sunday, let's say at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we would do something at 11 o'clock or whatever. So it worked out pretty well for a while.